What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the shelf. Happy Friday the 13th, and what better way to celebrate than by ranking what is possibly my favorite horror franchise of all time, Friday the 13th. I am super excited to do this ranking. In my opinion, Friday the 13th is one of the most consistent franchises out there in terms of horror. It's got some duds, but what franchise doesn't? It's also very diverse and has something for everyone. So we're just going to go in order from worst to best, so without any further ado, let's kick this thing off.
I don't think he's out there.
Why don't you just stick your head out and have a peek?
Yeah, so Jason X. Probably not too surprising. Before I continue, I just want to acknowledge that this movie definitely has its fans, and it's not without merit. You know, there's some good stuff to like here. The liquid nitrogen kill, in particular, is a big standout. But the reason it's at the very bottom is it's just too campy, it's too cheesy, and it decidedly does not feel like Friday the 13th, like, at all. Something that this movie and a few of the other ones have in common is this notion that, in my mind anyway, Friday the 13th and the 80s decade are so synonymous. Like, it started in 1980, I think the last one was 88 or 89, so like literally for a decade we were getting these movies. So much of Friday the 13th's identity is tied to the 80s in my opinion, and it's like once we left the 80s, a large part of my love for the franchise went with it. If you're looking for something different, like, this is definitely a place that you can go, but it's not a place that I find myself going very often. Coming in at number 11, we have
Jason Goes to Hell.
Yeah, so Jason Goes to Hell, same thing kind of applies here. Despite being 1993, this one feels a lot different from the 80s movies. And then in general, this movie is also just very different. Again, similar to Jason X, the biggest compliment I can give this one is that it's going for something different in a series where a large part of these movies feel very similar. So I'll give it props for that. The problem is that this is just not Friday the 13th to me. It's just not. When I think of Friday the 13th, this is not the movie I think of. Instead, with this one, Jason kind of like bookends the film, and they make the decision to have it be this weird like possession body swap horror film. It's just bizarre, but that's what they were going for, so it's hard to really knock them for it. It's just not something that I personally find myself wanting to see over and over again. Coming in at number 10, we have
Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan.
Yeah, so Jason Takes Manhattan is my number 10. I will be the first person to praise the Paramount era of the Friday the 13th films. However, I will also be the first person to say that by the time we got to this 8th entry, the tank was pretty much out of gas. Like, we were running on fumes here. Even if you completely put aside the fact that it makes no geographical sense that there is a boat that can take you from Crystal Lake to New York, there are just so many other weird and off-putting decisions here, and it's not enough to offset the few amount of cool things that there are to be had. So overall, this one is gonna fall towards the bottom of the list for me. This one, though, like every other movie in this franchise, it has a fan base, and I can totally understand and see why. Sadly for me, this one just jumps the shark too much. Coming in at number 9, we have yeah, Friday the 13th, 2009. This is one that might get me into some trouble with some of you. The thing that it gets praised for a lot is the opening, and I can understand why. It's got this whole other separate group of teens that are all just fodder for this super brutal version of Jason, and that's super cool because it's sort of like this twist. Like, the first time you see it, you're like, oh, these are our kids for the movie, and nope, it's this long cold open, they all get murdered, and then you get introduced to arguably an even worse group of kids that make up the majority of the film. So that's fun. But But that cold open is not enough to make up for the rest of the movie, which consists of abysmal characters and like really awful dialogue and jokes that have aged really poorly, in my opinion. You know, there's like on-the-nose jokes about the one black character liking rap music, and jokes about the hick character having sex with a mannequin, played by Lil Kev from Always Sunny. The needle drops here are also terrible and like really tonally weird and out of place. Yeah, you know, the 2000s might be my least favorite decade for horror, and this movie exemplifies a lot of the reasons why. And somehow it's actually aged more poorly than some of the 80s movies for me. Coming in at number 8, we have... It's important to note here that from here on out, these are all movies that I either like, really enjoy, or just downright love. The ones prior, I think, are just fine, but they're definitely not the first ones that I go to when I'm doing a rewatch. This movie is just ridiculous, straight up. The fact that it even got made in its current form is something that is nothing really short of a miracle. The history of the development of this movie is really interesting. If you're not familiar, I'd suggest brushing up because it'll probably actually make you appreciate this movie even more than you already might. This movie has kind of like a gross vibe to it. It's hard to exactly articulate what I mean by that, but if you watch it, then you might know what I'm talking about. Because of this, it's not one that I find myself revisiting often, but when I do, it's usually because I'm kind of in the mood for that sort of thing, and it usually winds up being a solid enough time every time. I have a lot of nostalgia for this one too. This might be the first Friday the 13th movie I ever saw, so it's got that going for it. Ultimately, this thing could have been so much worse, so this is probably the best version of a Freddy vs. Jason movie that we ever could have gotten, to be honest. Coming in at number 7, we have... Jason vs. Carrie. It's definitely the second worst of the Paramount 8, but it gets points for me because after a long string of movies that are all more or less doing the exact same thing, this one decides to go in a new, more supernatural direction, which I appreciate. The biggest criticism that seems to get hailed at Friday the 13th is that all of the movies are very similar feeling. And I would argue that that's actually not true, because every so often they kind of take stock of that fact and then they throw something weird into the mix to kind of mix things up. So like part 6, part 7, part 8, part 9, and 10 all do feel very distinct, and then you have the first 5 or 6 that all are pretty similar. So no matter what you're in the mood for, this franchise has you covered. But yeah, New Blood just kind of goes for it. It's the one that gave us Kane Hodder, so we'll always have it to thank for that. I also really like the finale of New Blood because it's got a lot of like sets being destroyed and like cool effects that were such a breath of fresh air when you're watching these all in a row. Coming in at number 6, we have... So, The New Beginning. This one's pretty divisive with fans, it would seem. After the final chapter wound up not being the final chapter, they decided to go the copycat route and spice things up a little bit. Some people enjoy the Roy Burns character, some don't. I think it's fine, you know, it's definitely not offensive to me or anything like that. It kind of comes out of nowhere, but it's also like kind of telegraphed if you're really paying attention, because, you know, Roy Burns gives this very ominous look at the camera. But by the time the finale comes around, you've basically forgotten about him, so I guess because of that, it might actually be considered effective. This one is also probably the sleaziest of all of the movies, and contains what I would say is the best set of boobs in the entire franchise. Which is saying something considering how many boobs are in this franchise. There are a lot. Tommy Jarvis gets recast, and then he gets recast again. So it's kind of confusing probably, but I don't know. It doesn't really matter though, does it? It also has this, so it gets points for that.
Ooh, baby, ooh, baby, ooh, baby, ooh, baby.
Coming in at number 5 is... Alright, so Friday the 13th Part 3 is a bit of an odd one. On one hand, it's got some things in it that do make it stand out, but it's also the one where if you're watching these all for the first time and you get to Part 3, this one might be the one where you're thinking to yourself like, are these just all the same movie over and over again? So obviously it stands out because it's the one where Jason gets his iconic mask. It's got that very memorable and super effective 3D effect going for it. And it's also got a finale that features a very creepy and unmasked Jason, so it's, for me, very memorable for that. I enjoy my time with this one, but The Final Girl is sort of a flatline, and unfortunately for it, it happens to be sandwiched between what I would consider to be the 2 actual best titles in the franchise, so... Coming in at number 4 is... Yeah, the OG, the big dog. Friday the 13th, 1980. This one's interesting. It's a self-admitted ripoff of Halloween, which is my actual favorite horror film of all time. The irony is that it does all of the suspense and overall craftsmanship of that movie much worse in every single way. But it still has its own little charm, despite all of that. It's got a fun cast of kids, with Adrienne King's Alice being one of the better final girls of the franchise. You know, this one's interesting. It could even be considered the black sheep because it kickstarted the franchise, but it doesn't have Jason in it. Pamela's reveal kind of comes out of nowhere. You know, there's really nothing prior to the 3rd act that could suggest her involvement as the killer. It's, you know, kind of comes out of nowhere. But despite all that, it's got a very cozy vibe and atmosphere that is just something that keeps me coming back to it over and over again. Coming in at number 3 is... This one and another entry in the franchise are the 2 that are considered often by fans to be the cream of the crop, you know, the best in the franchise. For me, it's definitely one of the best, but it's not the best. But it is definitely the most fun entry in the franchise. It's one of the very few that actually has its own distinct style. You know, it's like when you watch this one, maybe in a marathon, it's like a shot in the arm, you know, it kind of wakes you up. You're like, oh, this is actually kind of different. You know, they're actually having fun with this one. It feels like it's got its own trademark style to it, which is really cool. You know, contrast that to like the first time I watched all of these, and I'm watching like 1 through 5, and I struggled to remember individual characters and moments from each one. I'm like, did that happen in this one? Or did it happen in that one? Like, they all feel very similar, and this one is very different. Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis is definitely the best portrayal of that character, and Jennifer Cooke as Megan is probably the final girl I had the biggest crush on.
There, you happy?
And director Tom McLaughlin brings this sort of Frankenstein approach to Jason's character that I think really works well. really lends itself to that character. And this one has a lot of meta, self-aware jokes and moments that further elevate this one and allow it to stand out from its predecessors. Coming in at number 2 is... The Final Chapter. This is the creme de la creme, bona fide slasher royalty. 4 movies in, they finally figured out the sweet spot, and this is it. Well, almost. For many it is. I have one I like a little more, but they're pretty close. Let me tell you, they're like neck and neck. Tom Savini came back for the first time since part 1 to do the special effects, and he brought his A game. He reportedly came back so that he could kill his creation. You know, it's kind of funny that him or anyone thought that this would be the final one. Not only is this not the final chapter, it's not even the last movie to have the word final in the title. So, honestly, they should have made the 2000 remake called The Final Chapter, because seemingly we'll never get another movie after that one. Corey Feldman is super charming as Tommy, Jason is great here, and Crispin Glover is chewing up the scenery. I mean, this guy is just crazy. I mean, look at this. This guy makes the movie. It's fantastic. And coming in at number 1 is... I don't know how hot of a take this is, but part 2 is my favorite. Across this entire franchise, the characters are really nothing to write home about. However, the characters here are probably the best, with Amy Steele's Ginny actually exhibiting what could pass for character traits. She's established to have this psychology background, which is what allows her to get an upper hand on Jason in the final act. Sackhead Jason is super creepy, and I really love that look. I wish that maybe he'd kept it around for a couple more movies, but I understand why the hockey mask became so iconic, so overall I'd say it all worked out. Unmasked Jason here is super creepy and definitely memorable. It also features that famous campfire exposition scene that is so prevalent in a lot of my favorite camp slashers, which is a genre that I love so much. Well guys, that is it. That is my ranking of the Friday the 13th franchise on this lovely Friday the 13th. Let me know your rankings down in the comments below. I'm curious to see what people consider to be the best one. It could be a toss-up between a variety of entries depending on who you ask, so definitely curious to know that. If you liked this video, check out my camp slasher video. I'll try to put it right here or down in the description. Make sure you like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. We talk about new movies, old movies, physical media, and horror in general. So with all that being said, please take care and watch more movies.